So, very, very important figure that I believe doesn't get the credit that he deserves, but who had a tremendous influence, specifically on this topic we were just discussing in the break, over the assimilation of Jews in Western Europe over the course of the past 2 or 3 centuries. There's Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. He, aside from the yeshiva Breuers, is named after him. Yeah. YRSRH, Rav Yeshiva Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. So, Rav Hirsch was probably, I think it's maybe not unanimously agreed, but I would make the case that he probably is the founder of, intentionally or unintentionally, what we call today the modern Orthodox movement. And that's of very great importance. I'll explain to you a little bit why. He was born in 1808 in Hamburg, which was a relatively large German Jewish and religious community at the time. And the reform had already started at the end of the 18th century. So he was born into a community where already you had reform temples, they called them. Incidentally, does anybody here know why the Reform Jews call the synagogue a temple?
Because they believe we don't need the Bet HaMikdash anymore?
It's a very theological thing, right? They believe that there's no more need to pray for Israel. They were perfectly content with assimilation. What they believed, which incidentally they copied right out of the Vatican, was that any place that a Jew prays is his temple. We don't need a Bet HaMikdash in Israel. We don't need a Bet HaMikdash in Israel. For that matter, we don't even need the state of Israel. Anywhere where a Jew finds a connection to God or to his community is considered as holy as Bet HaMikdash. This is precisely the early Christian attitude towards Israel, towards Hebrew, towards Bet HaMikdash. They refer to, ironically, they would call the church Knessia, as they do in Hebrew, Bet Knesset or Bet HaKnesiot, which is the same word we used for Bet Knesset. But it's a place of gathering. The Reformed Jews went one step further. They're not bringing korbanot in the Vatican. The Reformed Jews went ahead and said, we call this the temple. Why? Specifically because we have no intention of moving back to Israel. We have no intention of identifying ourselves outside of the house in any way that distinguishes us from our non-Jewish compatriots. Effectively, the line was, and this was the famous Moshe Mendelssohn line, I believe, by the way, that none of his grandchildren married Jews, just putting that out there, but feel free to look that up and call me on it. That's what I understood last time I looked this up. So his line was, you can be a Jew at home and a man outside. Right?
So if you're a Jew, you're not a man.
Think about this. So this is the algebra, right? So think about this, right?
So that's the Maranos.
Sein Jüde zu Hause, be a Jew when you're at home, und ein Mensch draußen, and be a man when you're outside the house. So what does that imply about Judaism and the outside world?
Not compatible.
Incompatible, fundamentally incompatible. You can't be Jewish outside. Why? Because I decided you can't. I'm tired of fighting, I don't want to argue anymore. I don't know, I decided I'm not fighting this anymore. So this was the prevailing attitude in many bigger cities in Europe. Ultimately, the assimilation began in bigger cities and moved towards the suburbs, towards the more rural agricultural areas. The Jews in Germany and in France, since the emancipation, those probably were the 2 most integrated Jewish communities in Europe. Okay? Don't make the mistake of assuming that all the Ashkenazim are the same. I know it's tempting, they're all bright, but nonetheless, you'll find
Germans.
they're not all blonde. You'll find that the Jews in places like Poland and Russia were, well, let's put it this way. They were generally considered by the Jews of Western Europe to be much less educated, both religiously and secularly, and that's not necessarily inaccurate. So the standards of education, these are much poorer countries. Let's be fair, the Goyim were also not especially well educated, so it's not like Poland and Russia have a culture of education. They have a culture of alcoholism and misogyny. But the prevailing attitudes in the West were that we're more cultured, we have more understanding of science, music, history, there's better infrastructure, there's more technology, we read more books. And the Jews from the East are less Ostjuden, they call them. Jews from the East and Westjuden, Jews from the West. Jews from the West were considered classier, but at the same time less observant, or a little bit more discreet about their religious observances. The Jews in the East, they had emunah, they were simple people, and unfortunately assimilation hit both places. in Eastern Europe, the Jews were assimilated because they knew very little, and they were very easy targets for society that started to become more secular, more integrated. They were looking to break down the barriers between them and the Goyim. So it's not like someone had to convince a Jew in Poland that he should be Catholic and he should convert. They're just saying, look, we're not that religious either. It's okay. Why don't you join us? Let's be secular and have a good time. In Western Europe, it was much more intentional. It was much more by design. It was engineered. People really were looking for a way to either be as minimally observant as necessary outside of the house, or to leave it altogether and just say, look, I can be integrated, the Goyim, they like us. And
can you say that again, the difference between Western Europe and Eastern Europe in terms of, what you just said about how intentional was the process of assimilation?
So the process of assimilation in Western Europe was a much more active one. Both because the societies, Poland and Russia, to this day there's no law in these countries, right? France and Germany had laws, and the laws guaranteed you certain rights during the emancipation. The Jews fought for it and won.
In general, also like the control in general.
The non-Jews in Poland don't have rights. It's not like
I mean the Enlightenment, the cultural. Of course, that was much more present in the Western Europe than in Eastern Europe.
Well, Western Europe in general to this day is much more literate. I mean, this isn't eugenic theory. This is fact. These cultures were a little bit, but you had the difference between Western Europe and Eastern Europe was that in France and in Germany, you had people who read. You had thinkers, theologians, political commentators. You had so as issues came up. Look, the Dreyfus Affair was one of these famous discussions. That you had secular society that actually examined itself. Jacques wasn't written by a Jew. He was a nice guy, but he wasn't Jewish. So the ability of a society to analyze itself, to introspection, to say this is what we really want, they gave the Jews equal rights. This is the beginning of the 19th century. After Napoleon, and then in Germany it took longer. Ultimately, they got recognized as citizens. They got passports, and the mechanism of assimilation was much more proactive. In Russia and in Poland, the Jews living in the east, Ukraine, Galicia, it was much more passive. It was just there was very little infrastructure. People couldn't afford an education. Even secularly, they weren't as well educated. Maybe in the bigger cities a little bit more, but the mechanism was much more passive. It was just people spiritually were starving to death in Poland and Russia. So all you had was the community. If you were part of a community, people did whatever they did. And if you lived in a big city, there was a yeshiva. Maybe people were a little bit more strictly observant. Otherwise, people would observe from what they knew. They would see from generation to generation.
So can you say that in Eastern Europe, the process was more about you are just less observant, but you don't necessarily create a different movement? While in France
Correct.
and Germany,
There was a much less, the point I'm getting at is that there was a much less organized movement towards assimilation in places like Poland and Russia.
Because Italy, if you think about it, pretty much was the same thing. It never was, at least until today, a reform movement, but just people would start being
observant. So in France, you have, for example, l'Alliance Française Universelle. This is a very actively assimilating group. I mean, when they came to Djerba, Rav Matzliach Mazuz says, what do you want? He said, no, we're going to teach you French and make you modern. They said, okay, we have Arabic, we have Hebrew, we don't need another language. Thank you so much. It's a famous letter. You wrote them a letter. I appreciate it. Get out. We don't need you here. They came to Morocco and they started teaching a little bit here, a little bit there. They opened schools. They had money, and all of a sudden they started telling people, you can cut your payload, you can shave with a blade.
And they ruined the Sephardi pronunciation.
Well, effectively, yes. In fact, what about His father told me, he admitted to me, when he heard me once reading with a wow, he says, I used to read like that. I said, when? He said, till I was 6 or 7. So what happened? He says, they had this teacher from the Alliance, the Ashkenazi guy.
Does my father say?
Uri Marciano. His father, Rafael. So he says, this guy from the Alliance came and he saw me, and he was a Hebrew teacher, right? He says, what are you reading? He says, Vayikra Hashem el Moshe. He says, Va. He's like, okay, Va. That's what you said. It's what it is, the times change. So the mechanism of assimilation was a very proactive one in Western Europe. There were really people who thought about it, who wrote about it, who negotiated, who discussed, who tried to encourage people to join them. And the antidote, therefore, was something much more sophisticated. You weren't going to fight with a Jew in Poland about theology and different understandings of Hashgacha and Olam Hazeh. They weren't necessarily cut out for it. Maybe in the bigger cities you had a few people who were learned yet. On the whole, it wasn't. These weren't especially well-educated communities. With the Chassidut, a little bit more. it really blew some life into the Jewish communities of Poland and Russia. So Rav Hirsch was not combating ignorance. That's the real point that I'm trying to make. He wasn't fighting with people who don't like to read. These weren't people who are on Facebook all day and don't know how to spell simple words. These are people who believe, who have a system of beliefs that convinces them, that compels them to look to integrate themselves with the Goyim. Why not? Sometimes they even use fancy slogans like Ma'or Goyim, we should be a light unto the Goyim, we should integrate with them, mix with them, inspire them, motivate them, learn from them, etc. Very quickly this movement became nothing, it was just partying with the Goyim, basically. If you're lucky, if you made it, you married a German girl. You were successful because you married an Aryan woman. I mean, that was the big accomplishment. So he began a very intellectual process of addressing the problem of assimilation and what makes the Jews different from everyone else. That's why I specifically chose to pair him with Qorah, Lavdil, in this concept of Kedusha, not being visible or tangible or audible or palpable, but at the same time, that there's a tradition, that this is we are the nation that taught the world about monotheism, about Nevu'ah, that Eretz Yisrael is definitely an active part of our theology. We believe, we pray for it, we hope to return, etc. We shouldn't be getting too comfortable in Galut. He was also the first one who began to address issues of science and medicine in some of his writings. He was a learned man. He wasn't a doctor, but he had studied quite a bit of secular science in order to be able to respond to people who say, what do you hold from this, or how do you understand that, or evolution was very popular at the time. This is, don't forget, Darwin is what, 1840s. So he lived through this and continued to write on it, and didn't mind, just like the Rambam, if you remember, we talked about the Moreh Nevuchim a number of times. I told you a bunch of times that the Rambam never said Aristotle is a proof of anything. But he does quote him every so often, and he says, even Aristotle understands this, or even Aristotle believed this, or even the Greek philosophers understood this, or based on their study of logic in general, they came to this conclusion. So he's not using it as a proof. He's saying, you don't need to be a religious Jew. Tell me because I'm a rabbi and I have a beard that I think this. Okay, but here's a totally secular Greek philosopher who tells you, I believe that, the more you think and the more you contemplate, the more you consider, the more spiritual you can be said to be, and the more you behave like an animal, the less God wants to do with you. So he said, okay, you don't need to be a Kabbalist to come to such a conclusion. So if it helps you that he brings a scientific proof or a scientific explanation to something, why not? Why not? He'll take whatever proof he can find if it's convincing and compelling. There's a famous book that Rav Hirsch wrote. Today it's not very popular. You will find it. I think Feldheim translated it. Die 19 Briefe, the 19 letters, the name of this book. And it was a book, from what I understand, it was fictitious. It was basically interactions between two Jews, one secular and one religious. And the secular guy comes up and there's very well put together arguments. This isn't the Kuzari. Sometimes it looks like he's basically presenting a soft argument that's easy to diffuse. And he was asking real questions. Why should I behave any differently if it only brings us anti-Semitism? Why should I embrace the Torah when the reality is that science today is taken out? They thought science then was the new religion. And so he writes back 19 long essays in which he explains really how, first of all, there's no contradiction between being Jewish and studying science. Why do you assume that if you go to university you have to stop keeping Shabbat? Aside from the fact that the anti-Semitic French professors make you take your tests on Shabbat, there's no reason to believe that the two lifestyles are necessarily incompatible. Hence, the beginnings of modern Orthodoxy. The response in Eastern Europe was very different. The response in Eastern Europe, by the way, at the head of this response in Eastern Europe, Rav Nachman Breslev, will tell you, no offense, but take all of your modernity, take all of your science, throw it in the garbage. I don't need any of this stuff. We were observant before these scientific explorations and discoveries. We'll be observant afterwards. These things only confuse you. They only make you believe that you can understand certain things, and it's a whole big house of cards because it begins without the fear of God, without the appreciation of the creation, and it only gets worse from there. And the more of these books that you read, if it's secular philosophy, he said the same thing on Moreh Nevuchim. He writes explicitly about Moreh Nevuchim, don't read this book. This is the Rambam. Rav Nachman Breslev says explicitly, don't read from Moreh Nevuchim.
How did you say that?
I violated this, and I'm proud of it.
You say that it's to doing this is like to Lizrok.
Lizrok et ha-sechel, lizrok et ha-chokhmah.
You use the term last time in the show on Sunday to say that you cast aspersion of the.
Oh, is what you're guilty of if you say that for the previous generations didn't know what they were doing or didn't do it right.
Yeah, so things like a Rambam is not that kind of.
Right. So no offense. Incidentally, you know who else said not to read Moreh Nevuchim? Tell me it's a Hasidic thing. No. Tell me you don't know this. Huh?
Lubavitcher Rebbe?
No, believe it or not, they do sometimes. They hold a lot from the
Rebbe, you
Rambam.
said, no, the Rebbe you said no. On the contrary, you said the Rebbe did.
The Rebbe didn't say this. No, they still
No,
study
no.
from the Rambam.
So
Not
it's
Moran
not
Nevuchim so much, but the
The
Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon. So this is the two opposites. You have the Chassidut on one side, the Vilna Gaon on the other side, who says, not because he has any disrespect to the Rambam, he just says that he was confused by secular philosophy. Don't read it. It appears in a comment he makes on the Shulchan Aruch where he says, don't read from these apocryphal books, and amongst them he says, you know, even the Rambam, as great as he was, the philosophy.
Moran Nevuchim Davka.
Moran Nevuchim Davka.
But he, like he, for example,
In
like
Halakha,
Mishneh Torah,
he's-
he takes Mishneh Torah's.
He takes it as the beginning of the codification of halakha. Yeah, he refers to it
But
very
it's
often.
not very difficult. I mean, it's not very romantic to say that someone that is an I don't know, say like
Apocryphal.
like can be a posek halakha.
That's Rav Sabato's response. The same Rambam who wrote halakha, the same Rambam who wrote Guide to the Perplexed.
Yeah.
That's it. You don't like it, you're not the Rambam. That's all. No offense. The Vilna Gaon never had the influence that Rambam had on the entire Jewish world. I mean, come on. So you don't have to agree with his approach. That's okay. You owe him respect, and you have to, you know, at least acknowledge that he had a different opinion from you, which is fine. The irony, though, this is Eastern Europe, right? Both the Vilna Gaon and at least some of the leaders of the Hasidic movements at the time were opposed to too much secular philosophy. Don't get too involved in these things. Mathematics, he
No,
studied.
when did he live?
He
Vilna
passed
Gaon?
away in 1799.
1799.
Yeah, I think 1720.
So it was
So
really
then-
before this
so 18th
reform
century.
movement.
No, he lived through it. He lived through it. Reform was starting
But
in the
we-
18th century. It already started. Moses Mendelssohn,
And what was
Germany.
his answer to that? Is that, I mean, it was different from, I
That
guess.
these people are evil. That they don't learn Torah. They don't observe the mitzvot.
So he didn't even engage with it.
No, no. His arguments in Lithuania were a little bit more difficult because you had people that were just Amei Haaretz that just didn't know anything. You had people that were very learned. His approach was much more intellectual. His approach was a little bit closer to that of Western Europe, except that they had more, you know, maybe focused a little bit more on Emunah. But the Vilna Gaon is basically the one who's viewed as the founder of the modern yeshiva movement, where you study Gemara, everything's in there. Whatever hurts, whatever you don't understand, whatever is problematic or difficult to come, just it's in the Gemara. Keep on reading, you'll find it.
And no Tanakh.
Well, he knew Tanakh very well, but apparently his disciples focus on it a little bit less.
So Rav Hirsch comes
So you have
later.
Rav Hirsch.
Comes later.
He was born after he passed. Yes,
Yeah. So he comes.
9 years after he passed away. Rav Hirsch is born. So Rav Hirsch's response was, "There's no reason we shouldn't be learning science or medicine as long as you begin and end with a respect for halakha and that you understand this in the context, the proper context of Hashem created the physical world. You can give me all the arguments that you want. Okay, Hashem created the world. You want to analyze atoms and molecules. You want to discuss chemistry. You want to discuss physics or astronomy. No problem. Hashem created all these things. Can I prove to you that because I believe in the Torah that this star is composed of this and that star is composed of that? It doesn't matter. It doesn't change my emunah. You can study these things all
So
you
what about
want.
the
So
big
his answer is not don't study science. And by the way, you'll find something very parallel to him by Rav Ashkenazi in Algeria. Rav Ashkenazi in Algeria was also the first one who studied, who went to university. And he had the same response, which was, we need to go to university. Obviously, society is pulling this way. If you'd like to be successful and at least somewhat educated today, you would have to expect that people should pursue studies at least to high school, if not past, not beyond. But his point was that we don't need to run away from these things. Our emunah is weak if we don't have a response. And this exactly, so Rav Hirsch did this a century before him. Rav Hirsch's point was, there's nothing in science that contradicts God. You have scientists with agendas, that's something else. But there's nothing in the science that contradicts the Torah, contradicts the creation. Which is fine. Oh, you found a few places in the Gemara that don't necessarily jive with the theory of evolution? Beseder. First of all, Chazal weren't scientists. Sometimes they give advice, sometimes they bring their opinions. What's halakha is halakha. If it's medical advice, the Tosafot already said about the Gemara, the Tosafot living in France in the 12th and 13th centuries, they already said they put an excommunication on any Jew who practices the medicine or any of these remedies prescribed by the Gemara. If someone thinks he's going to solve a certain problem or a certain illness by using whatever concoction, we don't understand what plants they're talking about, we don't understand what seeds, what leaves, what animals, we don't have access to these things. We lost this tradition. The Tosafot said, anybody today who tells you, I'm a doctor, and I'm going to practice the medicine as advised by Chazal, in the Torah, I said we would excommunicate, we would ban him from you wouldn't violate Shabbat in order to do this? I'm not going to do any of these things, I'm not going to make my own concoctions or grind something or make a paste or a powder out of it. because I have no idea, we just don't understand it. He said, okay, so there are certain things you don't understand from the Gemara. Because of this, you're going to throw out Shabbat. Because you're not going to put on tefillin, you're not going to eat kosher food. So he made very, very compelling arguments to a generation that was very sensitive to this. Now, a few other things you should be aware of. One of them is that, famously, Rav Hirsch was asked a number of questions regarding the practices of Reform Jews, and he gave opinions. So, for example, one of the more famous things that in the Beit Knesset, in the Reform Beit Knesset in Germany, they were already using organs, and they already had instruments like they do in church sometimes. So when he was asked about this, he said, "No, we shouldn't have any instruments. We can't play them on Shabbat or Yom Tovim anyway. So what's the point?" But he did permit them to start using choirs. Think of a choir. Growing up in America, you think of a choir. So you think of choirs growing up in America was like it's native to churches. There aren't too many synagogues that I've seen, but the German,
the Spanish Portuguese.
Spanish Portuguese, which is very much
In
under the
Strasbourg they
influence
have
of.
one.
In Rome.
Really? So Strasbourg is Germany, no offense, but
Yeah.
I mean the Jewish community
In Rome.
It sounds very churchy.
in Rome. Oh, so this is the Beit Yosef writes about this. The Beit Yosef writes in Hilchot Shabbat that on Erev Shabbat that the Roman Jews used to play musical instruments until the Shabbat began. They would put them down and they would begin Shabbat.
Okay.
That's the Beit Yosef 500 plus 600 years ago. So Rav Hirsch was the first one who actually admitted this practice into a Beit Knesset. It's an Orthodox Beit Knesset. Again, if it was Reformed, nobody cared. But he said that he didn't see any reason why halachically it should be forbidden. Nowhere else in Europe was this done at the time. He was the first one to permit it. Right away he was attacked. Rav Shmuel Salanter was the son of Rav Yisrael Salanter, the famous founder of the Musar movement. It's basically the non-Hasidic response to the Hasidic movement. And they were contemporaries, and so someone said, "Did you?" Huh? Technically, I think he was from Poland. Salanter was in Poland, but they swore allegiance to the Lithuanian yeshiva. That's basically how it went. So Rav Shmuel Salanter was asked once by one of his talmidim. He said, "Did you hear that Rav Hirsch permitted them to use choir in the Beit Knesset? He's making it like a church. What do you think it's mutar? We should do such a thing over here too." So he said, "No, absolutely not. There's no reason we should do such a thing here in Poland." And he responded. He continued in his response, and he said, "Still, I wish my chelek in Olam Haba would be as big as Rav Hirsch's is." So what was he saying? He was saying, no, here in Poland, where people are observant, they're not tempted by these things. Just let's keep it the way it is. Why open Pandora's box? Rav Hirsch is the goalie of hell. He's trying to prevent people from assimilating completely and from getting lost for generations to come. So in his mind, he made a decision that makes sense for his community, where he can admit something that was maybe inadmissible up until now. And he thinks that this will help retain some more people and keep a few more neshamot in the Jewish community. Why not? So what he did was good for them over there. It's not good for us over here. Not that funny.
Who say that?
Rav Shmuel Salanter, the son of Rabbi Salanter. So Rav Hirsch was basically, and incidentally, another famous incidents with him was when he went before the German parliament in order to convince them to overturn the prohibition against shechita. Believe it or not, there were anti-Semites in Germany at the time, and they campaigned against shechita, claiming it was inhumane. That was really just to cover.
So the debate is not new.
Yeah, no. In fact, it was at the same time that Switzerland forbade shechita, but in Switzerland they never overturned it because there were only like 5 Jews there. So in Germany, this was a
still
large
forbidden
community. It was a big
Switzerland, yes.
Switzerland, yeah.
But you can import.
Yeah, we can import.
No, you can't even import in Switzerland. You could bring only in for personal use, no?
No.
There's a butcher in
There's
Geneva.
butcher
Oh,
in
you
Geneva,
can
they
bring
import.
commercial.
Most people go and buy in France and Geneva, but there is a butcher.
Oh, okay. I thought it was only for personal use that you could bring from Strasbourg. That's when you go. No.
No, I don't know about Zurich, but there is definitely a butcher in Geneva.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure they have something, or maybe they import from
Zurich, they have more,
Germany.
probably they're more observant in
Bavaria.
Zurich than in Geneva.
Yeah.
Don't believe in
not-
Geneva or guy.
Yeah.
I told them.
I'll take it off my list.
No, if he does it, he'll have a televised shechita.
Well, no, it'd be asur to shechita and.
We will have to go visit him in jail.
It'd be good business now. So anyway, he not only appeared before the German parliament, but he managed to overturn the rule. To this day, you should know it's still permitted. Shechita is still permitted in Germany, even though there aren't that many Jews left. And the Muslim community currently benefits from this, which is what revived the whole discussion about whether or not they want to make it forbidden, just because they want to get rid of the Turks. They, believe it or not, there are other peoples the Germans don't like. But the point, and it's a very crucial one, is that Rav Hirsch probably would not have been heard out in the German parliament if he hadn't himself studied in the university. In other words, if it weren't for the fact that he himself had a background in science, that he could tell them, look, I understand what your concerns are, just so you know, this is how shechita is done, we're actually pretty quick about it, the knife is very sharp, the animal, the brain is stunned, once the blood pressure in the brain is effectively zero after 2 or 3 seconds, what goes on afterwards are these involuntary movements, and he basically presented the case that it's no less humane than hitting the animal in the head with a nail. That's how they used to do this. If you know her, Brigitte Bardot, she was the one who protested against this in France. One of the first animal rights activists, right? Because she has no mercy for Jews, but she has mercy for animals. So the way they used to kill animals in France, they would just take a hammer with a nail, and they would hit the animal in the head. This was the humane way to kill, because using a knife was considered inhumane. Can't wait to have my skull pierced by a 1/4-inch bolt. But the argument that was made was that you should stop doing shechita. Why? Because shechita is inhumane, and this was so she protested against the killing of any animals, or at least this way. And based on this, they started implementing in France and elsewhere machines that do the same thing. They just use a bolt in order to break the skull. But so Rav Hirsch lived in a society that was very already assimilated and somewhat integrated into the secular non-Jewish society around it. At the same time, he used these utensils, used these tools that he got in the secular world and through secular science to help integrate halacha into the law, where it would be asur to get kosher meat. Knowing the German community at the time, I don't think too many people were going to stop eating meat, even if there wasn't kosher meat to be had. But he was able to reintroduce kosher meat, or to prevent it from being forbidden, specifically because the goyim had no choice but to respect his understanding and the logical argument that he presented. So it helps to be able to put together a rational argument that makes sense even outside the confines of halacha. So, Shakochem, that's up to you next week.
When did he die?
1888. 1888 or 1888.
ברשות שמיים וברשות האב וברשות חמד הרב.